I absolutely adore the stomach-churning, heart-sinking masterpiece that is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
That's Frankenstein.
This novel is one of the most incredible and important pieces of literature ever put to paper. It is a figurehead of the Gothic genre, a masterwork of horror, and the bedrock of science fiction. Written and conceived of by a teenage girl who was just trying to make the most of a really crappy summer. Talk about staying productive during your downtime. I read this book every year during the Halloween season, and in 2025, I was lucky enough to see Guillermo del Toro's astonishing adaptation not once, but twice on the big screen, and I adored it both times. Also, I have to say, I am really excited to see Maggie Gyllenhaal's The Bride with Christian Bale and Jessie Buckley. I just bought my ticket yesterday. Frankenstein's legacy is one of the grandest in literary history, and one that only continues to expand and inspire new creative voices. And over the past few weeks, I have compiled what I think is a pretty solid collection of novels that revolve around Frankenstein and Mary Shelley.
Well, seem to be quite a few books.
Oh, but wait, there's more. Let's get into it. To start with the one that I'm already reading, this is A Botanical Daughter by Noah Medlock. It tells the story of two confirmed bachelors in Victorian England, Simon, a taxidermist, and Gregor, a botanist, who work and live together in a converted botanical garden. When Gregor comes into the possession of a mysterious fungus that appears to show signs of sentience, even consciousness, the two men ultimately decide to bond it with a recently deceased young woman to create a living being, and by extension, a family of their own. I am 6 chapters into this book, and I am completely hooked. Next up is Our Hideous Progeny by C.E. McGill. This is in many ways considered a spiritual sequel to Frankenstein in that it tells the story of the titular character's great niece. Mary Sutherland has always been very curious about the fate of her uncle, but is also of an ambitious scientific mind in her own right, and is absolutely determined to make a name for herself and her husband. This opportunity appears to present itself when Mary discovers the secret of her uncle's creation.
Look at this!
I am only anxious to be done with A Botanical Daughter so that I can read this book. It sounds incredible. One of my favorite movies of the last few years was Yorgos Lanthimos' Poor Things, starring Emma Stone. This movie was a critical juggernaut when it came out, and in no small part due to it reworking the DNA of Frankenstein into a story of female empowerment, socialism, and personal liberation. This movie was released within a few months of Barbie, and Poor Things was, in my opinion, easily the most feminist film of that year. So it feels only fitting that I now give the novel on which the film is based some proper attention. Now, I've heard that the novel by Alistair Gray is very different in how it's structured, but that it is very radical, and like Frankenstein, wonderfully gothic and wonderfully weird. And moving right along, we have The Bog Wife by Kay Chronister. Now, this book doesn't have quite as overt or literal a connection as some of these other titles. It's not a retelling, it's not a sequel, but thematically, there is no small amount of overlap. Like Frankenstein, The Bog Wife is a gothic story, albeit one set in American Appalachia, which in a lot of ways sounds much scarier than the creepiest abandoned castle or foggy countryside you could ever present to me. So we definitely have the spooky aspect covered. But this novel also deals with reanimation, life coming from death, as well as the deeper themes surrounding complicated family dynamics and how the burdens we inherit from our parents and previous generations shape us as we grow. The book is about a family in West Virginia who hold a morbid tradition with the bog that sits on their ancestral property. With every new generation, the family ritualistically sacrifices the patriarch to the bog.
I'll never forget my old dad.
Which in turn brings forth from its depths a woman, a bog wife, to continue the family's line and ensure future generations. Absolutely fascinating premise, and I cannot wait to dive into this one. And now on to what I think is the most interesting title on this whole list, and what ironically has the least to do with Frankenstein outside of the name. This is Cleopatra and Frankenstein by Coco Malore, about a young woman named Cleo who meets and falls in love with Frank, a successful ad executive 20 years her senior. The book explores the span and evolution of their relationship from their meet-cute and initial connection,
I think I love him.
to their marriage and eventual meltdown.
Oh, you men are all alike.
Now, whether the book holds any subtext in common with Frankenstein remains to be seen, but something tells me that there will be. But regardless, it is a fascinating premise that appears to delve into the challenges and struggles of modern-day relationships. Next up, we have Anatomy, a Love Story by Dana Schwartz. This is the only YA entry on this list, but this book is drenched with gothic delight, and therefore I guess I sort of qualify as its target audience. This is about a young woman in 19th century Edinburgh who yearns to be a doctor but is not allowed due to being of the fairer sex. So in order to study human anatomy, she begins a secret partnership with a young man who digs up corpses for scientific research.
What a filthy job.
And, of course, romance ensues.
My sweet love.
The hair. Just been said.
Sorry.
I was really psyched to discover a Frank-inspired YA novel, and the premise for this had me so excited that I went ahead and grabbed the sequel as well. This is Immortality, a love story, and I can't say anything about it because I don't know anything about it. I have forbidden myself from even glancing at the back cover as I don't want to spoil a single thing about the first book before I get to it. I don't want to know what happens, who has plot armor, nothing. But I am looking forward to reading both. Now, these next 3 books I look at as a perfect unofficial trilogy because they all revolve around Mary Shelley and the fascinating and tumultuous events that led to her creating her masterwork. Love, Sex, and Frankenstein by Caroline Lee tells of the fateful summer where Mary attended a retreat in Lake Geneva alongside her husband Percy Shelley and her sister Claire Clairmont, hosted by none other than the notorious Lord Byron. Now, not too long before Mary's arrival in Geneva, there had been a massive volcanic eruption that released a tremendous amount of ash and dust into the air, leading to what was famously called in Europe the year without a summer.
Could be worse.
How?
Could be raining.
So because of the perpetually dismal atmosphere, Byron amused his guests by setting up a contest for who could write the best ghost story. This contest would ultimately set the stage for Mary to write what would become Frankenstein.
That's Frankenstein.
Now, this novel goes into all of that, but also into the relationships that she has with her lover and eventual husband Percy, her half-sister Claire, and how these dynamics would help shape and influence the birth of her literary monster. Mary and the Birth of Frankenstein by Anne Eekhout adds to this retelling by shedding light on a lesser-known chapter in Shelley's life, where she formed a deep and formative bond with another young woman named Isabel Baxter. Mary was sent to live with Isabel's family during her teenage years, and the 2 young women bonded over their deep love of stories. Mary's relationship to Isabel would apparently greatly influence and inspire her future creative endeavors. Now, I don't know how fast and loose these books play with Shelley's history, which is why I'm finishing off this trilogy with The Poet and the Vampire by Andrew McConnell Stott. This is a work of nonfiction that recounts the same legendary summer where Frankenstein was created, but also the birth of the literary vampire through John Polidori's short story, The Vampire. Now, I was actually all ready to film this video when I discovered these next 2 books, and I was like,
Hello?
I don't care if this video runs long, there is no way that this list would be complete if I knew about these books and didn't include them. So first off, we have the absolutely gorgeous looking Lodore, written by Mary Shelley. That's right, for those of you who aren't aware, Mary Shelley did write more than 1 book. Now, I was familiar with some of her other work, The Last Man being the other title I tend to associate with her, which in and of itself is considered one of the first pieces of dystopian fiction ever published. Seriously, Mary Shelley didn't just change the world of literature, she carved it. Also, fun fact, The Last Man apparently saw a major surge in sales during the COVID-19 pandemic due to its depiction of a world-ending plague, as well as its themes of isolation and loneliness, leading a lot of people to now refer to a book that didn't get the hottest reviews when it first came out as prophetic and profound. And I'm only going into this much detail because had I been able to find a copy of this book,
Where is it? Where is it?
I absolutely would have included it on this list, but I guess I did anyway, so there you go. But Lodore, on the other hand, is a book that I have to admit I had never heard of. Not once in my life have I ever heard this book referenced or discussed by anyone. I've been living wrong. Funnily enough, when I was in Barnes & Noble, I found this book sitting in the horror section next to Frankenstein, which is definitely a smart move in getting people to notice it. But as far as genre and tone, this is actually far more akin to a Jane Austen or Elizabeth Gaskell novel. It's not horror unless the idea of being a woman in 19th century Europe truly terrifies you. Definitely terrifies me. Lodore is actually the story of a mother and daughter having to navigate their lives independently following the passing of the family patriarch. These women now have to rely on themselves, carve their own paths, and thrive in a world where they hold very few rights and even fewer expectations from a heavily male-dominated society. Now, if you read Frankenstein and thought, oh, poor Elizabeth gets so little to do in this,
What is it exactly that you do?
And if you watched Del Toro's adaptation and loved the reinvention of her character, then I'd say this is absolutely the book for you. Now, I would argue that Elizabeth's lack of agency in Frankenstein is very much intentional and a statement in and of itself, but regardless, Lodore is Shelley getting to express her views on women's roles in Victorian society from the perspective of the women themselves. This, of every book on this list, is probably the one that I'm most excited to read for that very reason.
Glory, glory, hallelujah.
And speaking of women's roles, our next title is A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft. This is an essay written in 1792 that to this day stands as one of the early and formative texts calling for gender equality. Now, I'm purposefully avoiding using the term feminist to describe this book because this essay predates the word feminism by almost 40 years, and the feminist movement by nearly 50. But it was considered radical for its time in that it argued for women's access to proper education and their intellectual equality to men.
I suppose you're right.
Of course I am. I always am.
Now you're probably wondering, okay, but what does this have to do with Frankenstein or Mary Shelley? Well, without Mary Wollstonecraft, there would be no Frankenstein, and there would literally be no Mary Shelley because...
Mommy!
Yep. That's right, Mary Wollstonecraft was Mary Shelley's mother. She very sadly passed away shortly after giving birth to her daughter, so Mary never got to know her mother outside of her written works and her societal reputation as a force of defiance and rebellion. But it is beyond dispute just how much of an intellectual and creative influence Mary Wollstonecraft was for her daughter, and as far as talent for the written word was concerned, the apple did not fall far from the tree. And last but not least, unless we're going by page count, we have Mary Shelley Gothic Tales. This is a 50-page booklet containing 2 short stories written by Shelley herself, The Mortal Immortal, which is actually kind of hard to say, and On Ghosts. I actually thought about not including this on the list, but I found this at Barnes & Noble, which means there's a chance you might be able to as well. And I love that Barnes & Noble makes little travel-sized booklets like this. I would really love to start collecting these, especially because I love the cover art. And what a perfect title to start out with. And thus begins my stitched-together odyssey of Frank-inspired books to read over this year. Thank you so much for joining me on another book chat. Please like and subscribe. Also, feel free to leave a comment to share your thoughts on any of these titles, as well as any that you feel this list might be missing. Thank you for joining me, and
Good night, Frau Blucher.